In behalf of Group D, I would like to greet all of you a pleasant morning as we discuss today the Lesson 7 entitled The New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis, and I am the first presenter, and I will be tackling about the introduction of this lesson, which is the definition of culture. So, for the outline of this lesson would be first, defining culture; second, the new historicism and cultural materialism; and the elaborated definition of new historicism and cultural materialism that will be discussed by my groupmates today. So, defining culture. Who is Matthew Arnold? Matthew Arnold is a formative influence on English and American literary studies that sees as one of the sources of the book in which he asserts that an Englishman's heaven-born privilege of doing as he likes. Unfortunately, this sense of freedom does not lead to working class to the best has been thought and said, as Matthew Arnold believes, but because of them being unaware or because of their thoughtless vulgarity, that results to antithesis or the balance of contrasted ideas, words, and etc. against each other that makes it a culture. The book Culture and Anarchy is one of the major work that Arnold made sets a binary opposition that implies coherence and order, but together with that are chaos and lawlessness. However, before I proceed to discussing high culture, I would like to show you a simple analogy about binary opposition in order for you to visualize it very well. Okay, so as you can see here at the background, this is captured in Ortigas Pasig. You can see clearly that there are lots of buildings in there, and behind those buildings and infrastructures are the hidden slums of Pasig City that also shows poverty, which shows us the different social classes existing in one place. And it is identified through the basic terms, for example, light and dark, man-made and natural, above and below, noise and silence, and etc. So let's go back to high culture. The anthropologically defined culture always threatens its existence like a red thread running in English and American criticism. That the binary opposition in high culture and anthropologically defined culture gave the English studies the self-confidence. The idea of high culture is essentially different from other forms of culture because of its inherently oppositional role to play with regard to other cultural expressions. It explains the missionary zeal of the moral urgency that we so often encounter in classic English and American criticism. So, Leavitt stated that Arnold's best has been thought and said had the moral duty to defend high culture because it fits the description of being elite and to also maintain their standards. Although it had strong points or strong opinions about lower class and mass culture, and the tradition criticism did not much do to examine and understand it. So let's talk about Richard Hogarth. Richard Hogarth is presenting the humanist perspective, which he asserts that the more genuine working class magazine from the fiction that they print. For example, the females magazine are for female readers because of the female audiences and can be considered as a mass culture. Because based on Hogarth, they still have a felt sense of texture of life in the group where they cater for. Female readers are in some ways crude. Hogarth said, most of the material is conventional. Hogarth continues, That is, it mirrors the attitudes of the readers, but those attitudes are by no means as ridiculous as one might first be tempted to think. Another example of this is liking K-pop, and other people who also have the same interest as you can create a culture that only K-pop fans can only understand what's happening in that community that you created. Hogarth uses an older, more organic, and authentic working class culture because he believes that a new manipulative mass culture is taking the place of an older popular culture in which there was still a bond, a system of shared beliefs between a publisher and a writer, on the other hand, the audience and the other. Hogarth's book repeats the traditional Leavisite juxtaposition of authenticity and inauthenticity. Okay, so let's talk about Williams. William was in a literary academy and presented the Marxist perspective. He asserts that we need a common culture, in which he used the term that signifies a whole way of life and the ideas of nature of social relationship. So he asserts two definitions of culture. He said that in our culture as a whole, there is both a constant interaction between these ways of life and an area which we can properly be described as common to our underlying both. He also asserts that the working class culture is a social relationship and it is determined by solidarity. And the common culture is based on working class values. Both Hogarth and Williams is the basis of cultural critique for identifying what is value and rejecting which is not. It has shifted and these two are literary academics. Radically expanded the field of study of literary criticism, in which William introducing a virtually anthropological concept of culture, even if he grants the vital importance of the literature. Althusser and Foucault asserts that culture ideas is also an action in the form of cultural practices and power. According to Foucault, that culture is ideas, but also an action in the form of cultural practices. So, according to Foucault said that culture is ideas, but it is also an action in the form of cultural practices, and it is also a form of power. He said that power is no longer exclusively defined military, politics, and economic power anymore, but rather be seen in safer activities. No culture can claim authenticity. No culture gives access to truths that lie beyond self, beyond its own discourse, said Foucault.
Hi, good day. I am Shirley Melendres, and now I'll be tackling about the new historicism and cultural materialism. What are they in common of, and what are they argued on? To begin with, the constructiveness of culture and its annexation by literary studies are central of two major modes within contemporary criticism. First is the new historicism, which was American in origin and has remained largely American, and cultural materialism, which was mainly in British. So, on the other hand, both brought traditional study of Renaissance literature. Also, both is a mixture of Marxist and post-structuralist orientations, particularly of the work of Shakespeare, in particular post-structuralist notions of the self, of discourse, and of power, which I will be elaborating later on. So they also reject both autonomy and individual genius of the author, and autonomy of literary work, and see literary texts as absolute inseparable from their historical context. The role of the author is not completely negated, but it is a role that the author is at best only partially in command of. The author role is to a large extent of determined by historical circumstances. So, as for the prominent new historist critic Stephen Greenblatt stated that the work of art is product of negotiation between creators or class of creators equipped with complex, commonly shared repertoire of conventions and the institutions and practice of society. The literary text, then, is always part of the parcel of much wider cultural, political, social, and economic dispensation, far from being untouched by the historical moment of creation. The literary text is directly involved in history, instead of transcending its own time and place. The Anglo-American criticism had argued and still arguing that the literary text is a time and place bound with verbal construction that is always in one way or other political, because it is inevitably involved with one or more discourse or an ideology. It cannot help being a vehicle for power. As a consequence, and just like any other text, literature does not simply reflect relations of power, but actively participates in consolidations and construction of discourse and ideologies. Just like as it functions as an instrument in the construction of identities, not only at the individual level, that of the subject, but also the level of the group or even that one of the national state. Moving forward, literature is not simply a product of history. It also actively makes history. Needless to say that all this also holds good for cultural studies, because they do not see literature as a special category of transcendent, essentially a historical text, even it might be formally distinct. New historists and cultural materialists treat literary texts in the same way that they treat other texts, for their specific purposes, to trace and bring to light relation of power and process of ideological and cultural construction. There is no longer a difference between literature and other texts, no matter whether these are religious, political, historical, or products of marginal subcultures that so far have been ignored. So moving on to the differences of the new historicism and cultural materialism, the new historicism is leaning more towards a Foucauldian post-structuralism in its focus on power, on the discourse that serve as vehicle of power, on the construction of identity and other post-structuralist issues. Meanwhile, cultural materialism is leaning more towards the Marxism of Raymond Williams, who had coined the term cultural materialism in his 1977 Marxism and Literature, and its focus on ideology, on the role of institutions, and on the possibilities for supervision. Some cultural materialists prefer to call it dissidence. For deeper understanding, my groupmates will elaborate more about the new historicism and cultural materialism. So please listen carefully. Thank you.
Hi guys, a pleasant morning to all of you. I am John Brian P. Kayumo, and for today I am going to discuss to all of you some points of my topic, which is the new historicism. Due to many commonalities, some may ask, what does new historicism and cultural materialism have on the contrary? One distinctive feature is the role that subversion or dissent is allowed to play in them. Now, when we say subversion or dissent, it is the process of weakening the power of a specific system or institution. Catherine Bilsey, on the other hand, raised an altercation about the new historicism's view of culture don't encompass any space for dissent. Instead of minor revolts simply offer occasions for prolonging social control, crime legitimates an extension of the police. Now, the meaning of historicism, in which emphasizes fundamentally different, was received in 1982 when the prominent or well-known new historistic critic Stephen Greenblatt used it to describe his own work from the work that occurred in the past during Renaissance period. while the majority of commentators counteracted through positioning its origin in 1980 despite of Greenblatt's published book Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare. Now, Louise Montrose, also one of the prominent historicists, argued for the existence of power in a genre usually not associated with its exercise, that of the pastoral. Montrose examined that the role of Elizabethan pastorals in the symbolic mediation of social relationships in his essay, which is the Eliza Queen of Shepherds and the Pastoral of Power. Renaissance self-fashioning argues that in 16th century there seems to be an increased self-consciousness about the fashioning of human identity as a manipulable, artful process. This should not be taken as an implication, however, it was possible for Renaissance individuals to fashion a truly dominant identity, to fashion themselves fully and authentically. Now, Thomas More unveiled that his own project is a term that offers a measure of self-governing, or known as autonomy, that tends to emphasize an idea of living a life as a character shoved into a play where he consistently renews himself, prepared and aware of his own altered reality. And also John Brannigan's definition of the new historicism as a mode of critical interpretation which privileges power relations as the most important context of texts of all kinds. And his claim that a critical practice treats literary texts as a space where power relations are made visible. Now, to make it clear, power here does not consider any allocation from one's physical vehemence. It rather functions through discourses. Ideology offers the subject an idea. Complying is natural thing to do. Now, especially for dictates and indeed freedom, autonomous or governing decision. The new historicists see literature as actively involved in the making of history through its participation in discursive practices. Now, this practice, ladies and gentlemen, is a theory of the linguistic and sociocultural characteristics of redundant episodes of face-to-face interactions. One of its example is Louise Montrose's 1983 essay, which is The Shaping Fantasies, Figurations of Gender and Power and Elizabethan Culture, which tackles a broad spectrum of texts encompassing autobiography, travel writing, and a Shakespeare play. This in order for him to examine how representations of Queen Elizabeth I, the shaping fantasies of his title, partakes to the creation of the essentially political cult of the Virgin Queen. Now, socioeconomic circumstances delineating history that is a gist of a particular literary text's creation is not read to elucidate literature. That goes the same to the opposite position, which nor is literature read to allocate an idea directly upon history. Moreover, the historical period in question is preferably viewed as a remote culture with various discursive manifestation, any kinds of texts that have been disseminated to us, as well as which constitute all that we have to work with, must have a detailed attention and need to be delivered into attaching with each other so that the power relations and the forces operating in the culture may be summoned to enlightenment. Hence, it does not fully matter in which point we try to access it, but in our ways. Now, new historicism is adapted American anthropology, which is the Clifford Geertz. This does not solely revolve around, because he insisted that all culture is manufactured, but also because of his method of thick description, that is an analysis by way of minutely examined social and cultural practices that are recorded in an implicit detail. Now, Greenblatt's marvelous positions The Wonder of the New World of 1991, it operates in a field of inquiry that we would now label post-colonial. This creation examines the role that wonder plays in the response of European travelers to the New World. Now, Greenblatt emphasizes and marvelous positions the ways in which Europeans of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period presented non-European peoples and took possession of their lands, and particular the New World.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dianalyn F. Buragay, and I will be reporting cultural materialism in literature and culture together with my partner, Rian Pasco. During the mid 1980s, cultural materialist criticism dominated and established itself permanently in the field of English modern literature. Basically, during the mid 1980s, cultural materialism emerged as a theoretical movement in the along with New Historicism, both an American approach to early modern literature, with which it shares a common ground. Along with this came the publication of Jonathan Dollimore's radical tragedy, Religion, Ideology, and Power in the Drama of Shakespeare and His Contemporaries in 1984. Catherine Belsey's "The Subject of Tragedy, Identity and Difference in Renaissance Drama" in 1985, two collections of essays, "Alternative Shakespeares" in 1985, edited by John Drakakis, and "Political Shakespeare: New Essays in Cultural Materialism" in 1985, edited by Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield. Cultural materialism and New Historicism shares a common ground as both are engaged in the process of renewing our images of the past and revisiting them. Both are historical in context. Among such things, subjects cannot transcend their own time, but live and work within the horizon of a culture constructed by ideology, by discourses. Criticism often seeks to understand the impact of a work in its day, and it may also explore how many things or meanings change over time. For example, an old book with slaves as its subject is only applicable in their own time, as slavery in our current time is rare and is greatly criticized by society. Subjects such as this are then discussed and taken into context of ideology, whether if it is ethical in our current time and, and if it fits in our current culture. Ideological constructions is political and a vehicle for power. History is an ideological construct, and authors live in the respective time. As the book mentioned, ideological constructions that authors live in and have internalized inevitably become part of their work. That is why, because it plays an active role in the creation and consolidation of power relations, literature actively contributes to history. Literature records history, its traditions, customs, precedents, habits, injustices, and so on. Cultural materialism brings to light how ideology adjusts itself to new circumstances without losing its grip. Like the new historicism, cultural materialism brings to light how ideology, and thus the existing socio-economic and religious order, tries to maintain itself, or as the case may be, adjust itself to new circumstances without losing its grip. Since new historicism and cultural materialism are both historical in context, as I've mentioned previously, they both analyzes text closely and as such both observes how society, politics, economy, religion, and other cultural contexts adjust to new circumstances while maintaining its ideologies. Literature is read alongside a wide variety of non-literary texts. Finally, since the status of literature is not essentially different from that of other texts, religious, political, economic, legal, and so on, in the sense that it has no special access to genuine transcendent truth, it is read alongside a wide variety of non-literary texts. This is because the critic's response to a work is always influenced by his beliefs, prejudices, culture, and environment. What sets cultural materialism apart from its slightly older American relative? Cultural materialists agree that literary texts will at first sight seem supportive of contemporary ideology but see that ideology as less pervasive than their new historicist colleagues. Cultural materialists are less pervasive than their new historicist colleagues, as the new historicists are more hung up in pervasive issues such as power, discourse, discipline, subjectivity, sexuality, and government, which is an obvious influence of Foucault's work. And when it comes to cultural materialism, although Foucault is an obvious influence in their work also, especially with the regard to their interest in the insane, the criminal, the exploited, and all those who over the course of history have been marginalized, culture materialism follows Williams in his adaptation of Gramsci's view of hegemony. In other words, dominant culture is always under pressure from alternative views and beliefs. To clarify, dominant culture and hegemony are one and the same. Hegemony refers to the dominance of a shared system of ideas, values, and ethics within a society. So, while cultural materialist analysis of literary texts bring to light how these texts are inevitably conservative instruments of a dominant social-cultural order, they also demonstrate how the apparent coherence of that order is threatened from the inside by inner contradictions and by tensions that it seeks to hide. An example of this is Alan Sinfield's discussions of Shakespeare's Othello in his fault lines, cultural materialism and the politics of dissident reading. Fault lines could mean defectiveness and dissidence could mean disagreement. In Shakespeare's Othello, in the patriarchal culture, which can be considered as a dominant culture during their time, presents Desdemona, an obedient daughter who is bound to obey her father, leading her to follow his wishes in her marital choice. However, in the early modern period, inner contradictions arise, as there is an increased emphasis on the idea that marriage should be personally fulfilling. As a result, the social order comes under immediate pressure. It is the fault line in question that creates what Sinfield calls dissident potential. Dissidence is not so much a matter of individual agency, but it is first of all produced by the inner contradictions that characterize any social order. So, the contradiction in the ideology of marriage is one of Sinfield's fault lines. This contradiction in the ideology of marriage allows Desdemona to disregard her father's wishes and to marry a man who, from the perspective of the social group to which she belongs to, is totally unsuitable. Desdemona is Christian while her husband is a Moorish man. That is why there was a contradiction in Desdemonia's social group, hence creating the dissidence. This fault line creates what Sinfield calls dissident potential. Dissidence is produced by the inner contradictions that characterize any social order. Cultural materialists are also interested in the way Anglo-American criticism tends to hide fault lines and dissidence in text. Dollimore's Radical Tragedy argues, among many other things, that the traditional interpretations of the Jacobean tragedies that he discusses, including Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and Turner's The Revenger's Tragedy, have ignored how the plays undermine humanist assumptions because they focus on what fits the humanist framework. Rian Pascal will continue our report.
Good day, everyone. I'm Rian Alpasco, your last speaker for today's presentation. So, Ms. Baragay have already discussed about cultural materialism. So, as for me, I'll continue and talk about it further as I'll introduce you to some structuralists who are also involved in cultural materialism. So, aside of the things that the previous reporter have mentioned, cultural materialism also sees dissident readings of texts from the past as political interventions in the present. And to understand further this statement, dissident means a person who opposes official policy or either disagreeing especially with an established religious or political system, organization, or belief dissident elements in the armed forces. While the other one, the political intervention, involves influencing or manipulating the legal actions of another government. So as what Alan Sinfield have said, that cultural materialism sees that those dissident readings of texts in the past is a political intervention as of today or in the present. So those simple texts in the past is opposing the official policy before became a manipulation to the legal actions of another government. It became a weapon, maybe, since political challenges to the conservative, humanistically oriented positions and critical practices are still very much visible as it is an evidence among literary academics, those who have the luxury to study, and among those that control educational institutions. So, I've mentioned a while ago the critical practice, which is not only limited for alternative understanding in the past, but also it offers equally and overtly tries to effectuate a political change in the present from a broadly socialist and feminist point of view. You can check Catherine Balsey's discussion in her work entitled The Subject of Tragedy, which involves literary and non-literary representations of the 16th century of a murderess by proxy, which namely is Alice Arden. You can search her up in the web later on, who announces the investment of cultural materialism and feminism, which have led to a political change in the present. So, for the next slide, you might have already know or you're already familiar to Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield, since Miss Baragay have already mentioned them a while ago, if you just have listened though. These two theorists or cultural materialists have came up with a work entitled Political Shakespeare, in which they have also mentioned cultural materialism in their book. They even said that cultural materialism does not, like much established criticism, attempt to mystify its perspective as the natural, obvious, or right interpretation of an allegedly given textual fact. On the contrary, it registers its commitment to the transformation of a social order which exploits people on grounds of race, gender, and class. So, in my own opinion, or in my own simple statement, Dollimore and Sinfield meant that cultural materialism is not that confusing, as its only goal or commitment is to transform a social order in which it exploits the people on grounds of race, gender, and class. Just like an established criticism, it doesn't mystify the right interpretation of an allegedly given textual facts, and instead it makes it easier for the readers and express the truth directly without them being puzzled or being confused. Cultural materialists, just like Dollimore and Sinfield, seeks to find instances of dissidence, subversion, and transgression that are relevant in contemporary political struggles. And due to this, they decided to have a double focus in which cultural materialism became interested in the ways of how the literature works from the past. For example, Shakespeare's works. Dollimore and Sinfield even pointed out that while culture is made continuously, Shakespeare's text is reconstructed, reappraised, and reassigned all the time through diverse institutions in specific contexts. It doesn't have the same patterns, and instead it changes all the time, making it fit for the specific text that he'll use in his work. It also says that what the plays signify, how they signify, and how it depends on the cultural field in which they are situated. Though, for instances, there are some questions like which plays are still performed, and where and within what context, or either, in other words, how is Shakespeare constructed and from what ideological position? Cultural materialism tend to ask these questions, and in which Sinfield concludes that can be read in their book Political Shakespeare. He said there that in education, Shakespeare has been made to speak mainly for the right, and that is the tendency which this book seeks to alter. And the book that he mentioned, or he meant, is the Political Shakespeare. For cultural materialist, ideology takes on a tangible and material form in institutions such as the university, the museum, the army, the school, the labor union, the church, and a whole range of less influential organizations. It becomes material in a way which images and representations from the past are deployed in the service of contemporary ideology. And in the mid-1980s, cultural materialism testifies the effectiveness of its intervention, although it also demonstrates the strength and number of those literary academics who still prefer a more traditional and a broadly humanist, since we all know that these literary academics are humanist, mostly of them. Meanwhile, in 1990s, aside of feminism that I've mentioned a while ago, the agenda expanded its original interests and decided to incorporate issues of empire and sexuality, though there is still the intention of effecting political change in our current arrangements. Also in 1990s, this year became also another direction in which cultural materialism has developed. And that's the end of our presentation. I hope you've listened and somehow learned something from us, starting from the defining culture, our main topic or our main agenda, which is the new historicism and cultural materialism, and how we elaborate these two. I would also like to give thanks to our reporters for today, which are Miss Nopales, Miss Melendres, Mr. Kayomo, Miss Baragay, and especially me, Miss Pasco. Thank you for listening and having your time.